Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm once again joined by Patrice Dabrowski, and we are going to talk about part two of Poland's history, the next 500 years of Poland. In the last week we discussed from Poland's origin until the creation of the Commonwealth, and a little bit about how the Commonwealth worked. This week we're going to talk about from the Commonwealth until pretty much the year 2000. I think we're going to round it up there. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit as well. I want to talk a little bit about more recent events as well in Poland that happened recently, because I feel like it's important to talk about that as well. I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. But let's start where we left off with the Commonwealth and how did the Commonwealth actually function. Because, like you said, it was a superpower of its time, and everyone, like we said last time, I think, everybody wanted to be a part of the Polish electorate and, be part of become Poland's Lithuania's king or king for, and this was, a huge thing. So let's talk about a little bit about how this all functions.
Yeah, well, again, I did talk about the Commonwealth a bit last time, about the fact that this was this huge connection between Poland and Lithuania, now made official, if we can say, not just a dynastic linkage. And the country was an elective monarchy, which, as you just mentioned, made it a country that many kings or not yet kings wanted to be able to rule over. So the elections were always quite something to look at. We didn't talk much about that last time. The first king was a Frenchman, the second a Transylvanian. When we were talking about Poles getting all the way to Moscow, it was the beginning of what one might call the Vasa dynasty in Poland. The first of of what would be three Vasa kings being elected to the Polish throne.
Because Poland was also heavily involved in the 30 Years' War, right? Which gave Sweden the rise to power, or what? Or was
Well, it wasn't, but the Swedes would let Poland know what it thought of it at a slightly later date.
Mm. So let's talk about Sweden's involvement, because as a Scandinavian, it's kind of interesting for me, at least, to see that. I wouldn't say it's minor country at that time, but it feels like now a country like Sweden would be so heavily involved in, and of course we talk about Charles XII a little bit later as well.
Sure, of course.
So involved in Polish electorate and have this impact in Polish history.
Well, I mean, one of the things that came with electing a Vasa king to the throne is that he also had pretensions to the Swedish throne and never wanted to relinquish those pretensions. And so, come mid 17th century, you have an instance in Poland where things are starting to go downhill because of internal clash between the Cossacks within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Commonwealth proper. It's a civil war of sorts that takes place starting in 1648. Well, this keeps the Commonwealth quite busy for a while, and in the interim, the King of Sweden decides that he wants to interfere. So in 1655, he invades the Commonwealth and makes quite big strides, one must say. In fact, this has gone down in Polish-Lithuanian history as the deluge. So it's like a flood through the country, taking over parts, devastating parts, leading to another civil war because at one point, Lithuania, he was in control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which meant that you had two sides fighting each other and all that. So it really was quite a difficult and trying time for the Commonwealth.
Now, what made Poland, and we talked about obviously one factor, that it was such a huge territory, but it has been kind of described by some historians as a bit of a backwater as well. So why was it so attractive to be elected king of Poland, Lithuania, at this time?
Well, again, it was a very wealthy country, relatively speaking. That is certainly the nobility, and the top rung of the nobility was exceedingly wealthy. This is a country that you may remember we talked about last time, was exporting grain massively to the west, up through the Vistula River system, up to the city of Danzig, or Gdańsk, as it's now known. And this was a fabulously wealthy city. So there was a lot of wealth in the country, and of course, depending on who was striving to sit on the Polish throne, you know, it would be nice for something like, say, a country like Sweden, which is relatively small, to suddenly control this enormous territory with all this economic wealth.
Hmm. Now, of course, I know I'm probably skipping a little bit ahead, but another thing that happened in the territory of Ukraine, and that is, of course, the Mazepa revolt of the Cossacks, as we may have referred to earlier. So let's talk a little bit about why the Mazepa revolt is kind of important to Poland, Polish history, because, there, as the biographers has referred to the Mazepa revolt, and historians, the choice was either would they bind themselves to Poland at the time, or to Peter, the rising star of Peter the Great, whom we'll come back to as well. So, and it was really close to actually signing a pact with Poland. And of course, they ended up signing a pact with Russia, which I believe that Putin refers to why Ukraine still belongs to Russia. I believe that's one of his main reasons why. But let's
Actually,
talk
this
about
would
the
go back a little
importance.
bit earlier in history, if I may take it back
Yeah.
to this mid 17th century clash again. You do have the Cossacks essentially seceding, that is, taking the most easternmost territory out of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth and allying themselves with Russia at that time. There was an attempt, a very important one, in 1658 via the Treaty of Hajat, that was trying to get the Cossacks to come back into the Commonwealth and to become sort of a third portion of the Commonwealth. This is very important for Polish history. You have Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, then you have Rus, the Ruthenian territories. And there was a moment when it looked like that was going to become possible again. Now, when you talk about Mazepa, this is going into the Great Northern War at the beginning of the 18th century. This is also hearkening back to that sort of situation.
So let's talk about, because of course, as well as we had the rising star Peter the Great in Russia, we have to remember that Russia was not a territory, much because Peter the Great, I believe that Russia is territory is in pretty much up until now, but of course it wasn't the territory that it had, so we had to remember that it was a different size at the time of Peter the Great. We also had the rising star of Charles XII of Sweden. So let's talk a little bit about and we have to kind of, because Poland is of course heavily involved in Charles XII's endeavors as well when he was.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about Poland's involvement in the Great Northern War.
Okay, well, this is the Commonwealth again that we're talking about. And at this time, we have a new elected king on the throne. And he is Augustus of Wettin dynasty in Saxony. So he was not ever a king before he became king of Poland. He was elector of Saxony. Now, he was very ambitious. For himself, he wanted to, through gaining Poland-Lithuania control, he wanted to gain more territory for himself as a ruler of Saxony, and in this way managed to get into the bad graces of not only Sweden but also Russia. So he really brought on quite a devastating period into the Commonwealth. In fact, Polish historians generally call the rule of Augustus and his son, also Augustus, as the Saxon Night. it was extremely devastating for the country physically, and just very, very bad. And this is when you have the Battle of Poltava and Mazeppa and all of that in play as well. But what you really do have, it's true. I mean, when you look at Sweden at the time, no one would think that little Sweden could be so powerful. But again, you had Karl the
Probably the
12th. It
same.
was
Probably
just
the same with
amazing.
Russia, right?
Well,
That's
Russia
probably
was
thought.
just starting on its rise. This is the beginning of Peter the Great's greatness, if one can say so.
So nobody would probably think that Russia would become this massive empire that it would see to be for the next centuries, right? It wasn't
Well, it
written
was
in
on
card
it was
yet.
on the rise now. Yes.
So let's talk about, and again, as I said earlier, the signing of how close were they actually Mazeppa to sign his binding to Poland as a protectorate of Ukraine and Cossack land. Now, of course, it wasn't Ukraine then, but I'm just simplifying.
No, but the Cossack lands, which is
yeah.
essentially much of Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm just simplifying, calling it Ukraine for simplicity. But that's what caused it to end up with Peter the Great at the time and not Poland.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for Mazeppa and for the Swedes, the campaign did not go at all well, and so that essentially made all of this quite moot, because both of them had to escape. Both Mazeppa and Karl the 12th had to escape from the territory.
So, and what about Poland under the Great Nordic War? How did Charles? Because he kind of instated, that you said, he kind of instated the puppet king, right? Under his
Yes.
rule. So then
Yes,
what about Poland
Stanisław Leszczyński
during
was the
this?
puppet king at that time. Yeah, I mean, this was a devastating period for the country. It was, again, like a civil war, this Great Northern War that lasted for decades, essentially. Very, very devastating. So this Augustus, the strong, as he billed himself, proved not to be the strong at all.
So what happened to Augustus when he thought that he wasn't as strong as you might think?
Well, he got in the end, he started thinking that it was a wrong thing for him to do to become the king of Poland, Lithuania. That was not the best of his moves, because even Saxony was invaded during this period and everything. It was really, really very, very messy all around.
So let's talk about I'm sorry if I'm skipping ahead now, but let's talk about the time from Poland, from the time of Charles Great Northern War because I'm kind of excited about talking about this period until Catherine the Great come to power in Russia, because that is, of course, as well an important time in Russian history.
Yeah, well, I'd rather not do the Russian history, but stick with the Polish history.
No worries.
But of course,
take your time.
Catherine plays a huge role in the Commonwealth's history, because, again, I just mentioned we had two Wettin kings, two Saxon kings, Augustus and his son, Augustus. And after Augustus, the last king to be elected king of Poland was actually a regular Pole. I didn't mention earlier on, before the Saxon period of rule, we had two Polish kings, one of them being Jan the Third Sobieski, who saved Vienna from the Ottoman menace in 1683. So we had some good times under some earlier Polish kings, but now we have another Polish king, because usually it's a foreigner who sits on the throne, not an actual Pole. And this was Stanisław August Poniatowski. But the way he got to sit on the throne is because he had been Catherine the Great's lover back in Russia. So it was not due to any particular strength on his part, but rather he was supposed to be a puppet king. That he did not end up being one, tells you a little bit
Yeah,
more about that
that he
period and the Enlightenment and everything else that was going on at the time.
because Catherine thought that because he was her ex-lover, and he was kind of still in love with Catherine from what I remember. She thought he would be easy to
Easy to
control.
control,
Yeah,
absolutely. And he was not. I mean, he did what he could to try to uh, uh, restore Poland to a more greatness and more independence from the Russians, because since the time of Peter the Great, you had interference in the Poland-Lithuania's rule by the Russians. They interfered in the different uh, uh, elections. For example, in earlier on mid-century, Poles had decided they wanted to elect that former puppet king under Karl XII, Stanisław Leszczyński, to the throne. But no, Russia wanted Augustus, the son, to come in. And what Russia wanted went because of its army.
now it's time, and do forgive me if I have to go a little bit back again because I want to talk about the partition of
Well, we're not to the
Poland.
partitions
Yeah,
yet, so that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah. So that's what made Augustus so different than Catherine in matching because she thought she could easily control him. So when he first ascended to the throne, how how did he manage to, for a lack of a better word, escape the puppetry that she was hoping she could control him with?
Well, he did what he could to be a regular king and to act independently of Catherine. I mean, he tried to introduce new legislation because one of the things Catherine wanted was for the Commonwealth to remain just as it was, sort of decentralized, weakened, with a small army, because Peter the Great had insisted that the army be very small, and so on and so forth. And so Poniatowski did what he could to strengthen the country. He built up Warsaw, was a very cultured man, was very engaged in that side of Polish culture. And ultimately, he was able to at least accomplish certain things, except for the fact that then we had the period of partitions.
Hmm. And now, of course, I feel like we have to bring in the rise of Prussia and, of course, the Habsburg family as well. So let's talk about the rise of both, because they will become important. And when we talk about, the partition of Poland a little bit later, so let's talk a little bit about Prussia and Habsburg feud as well,
Mm-hmm.
because they are important. That
Yeah,
will finally see the partition of Poland that would divide the country until
right.
1918. So let's talk about a little bit about the feud
Well,
between
definitely
Prussia
one
and
needs to say
Habsburgs.
something about the rise of Prussia, because Prussia had been just a little country for a very, very long time. It started out, Prussia proper, as this was a land that had been ruled by the Teutonic Knights back in the day, and became a fief of the Polish crown. Now, what happened is the Hohenzollern family, with time, got control over Prussia, and in fact, in the 17th century, finally got Prussia, the ducal Prussia, because there were two Prussias, I should say. There was ducal Prussia, that was under the Hohenzollerns, and there was royal Prussia with Danzig under the Polish crown. So you have these two very distinct Germanys, or Prussias, if you will. Um,
Yeah, I can just pause the recording in just 5 seconds.
is of
Yeah,
Prussia.
wait, okay, carry on. Yeah.
Okay, so continuing with the rise of Prussia, Prussia is constantly gaining at the expense of the Commonwealth, becoming stronger and stronger over the centuries. And so you get to the position at the beginning of the 18th century where you have uh, Friedrich III, the Duke of Prussia, crowning himself king in Prussia. He can't crown himself king of Prussia because there's royal Prussia that belongs to the Commonwealth. So he crowns himself very in an elaborate, fancy way, king in Prussia, assuming that everyone will forget the in part over time.
Kind of like Napoleon and how he crowned himself emperor of the French and not French
Yeah,
emperor, if
you
I
could say
remember
that.
correctly.
There'd be anyways, but he pushed the bounds of what was possible. And again, the Prussians were Prussia was ruled by a series of pretty good rulers, and so that all helped in getting to the period where you had Friedrich the Great. Because again, when we talk about the partitioning of Poland, you have Catherine the Great, Friedrich the Great, and Maria Theresa of Austria-Hungary, or not Austria-Hungary, it was still Austria, in fact, not even Austria yet, of the Habsburg realm, speaking more properly. That being, again, the big country to the south. And a country that also at one point had gained territory from the under Jagiellonian control, as you might remember from last time's talk.
So Maria Theresa is a fascinating woman, and I wanted to ask because the Habsburgs actually went into the capital of Prussia, in the Habsburg-Prussian War. So what I'm kind of skeptical in using the term Frederick the Great.
Yeah, greatness is all in the eyes of the beholder, of course.
Yeah, I feel like he should be more lucky, probably because Frederick the Lucky rather than the Great, because it was just kind of lucky that the Habsburg troops didn't occupy it, and that they weren't, trained in. From what I understand, the Habsburg forces were mainly trained in defense and not actually offense. From my understanding, but he was more lucky than
he gained control over Silesia from the Habsburgs, as you recall. So I don't know how lucky that was. I think that showed some deftness on his part.
And let's talk about the occupation of Silesia and how, of course, this will become later as well important to the Polish participation.
Well, again, Silesia had been originally part of the medieval Poland. Then it came under Jagiellonian control because it was together with actually, here I'm getting this wrong. I'm talking about some other territories of the Habsburgs, but at any rate, Silesia was long under Habsburg control because it was leaning towards the empire, the Holy Roman Empire. But Prussia got a hold of it at a certain point in the mid 18th century. So things were changing in that regard as well. In fact, Maria Theresa very much wanted to regain Silesia at a certain point. And even when she got control over parts of the Commonwealth, the part of the Commonwealth that will be called Galicia, she wanted to trade it for Silesia, if at all possible, but it never worked out that way.
No, sorry if I'm skipping ahead of time, but let's talk about the partition of Poland. And I know the famous saying goes that, Maria Theresa wept, and then she took some more, and then she wept again, and she took some more. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the treatment of the three different provinces that were shared between, Prussia, Russia, and, as you do in the book as well, and Habsburg.
Right.
So let's talk about the partition, because it's not just one partition of Poland. It was seven.
Three separate parts. Yes,
it was three partitions, more or less, of Poland.
Yeah,
that would end up over time. So it wasn't just one, like through the colonies of Africa. It wasn't just like one line. There you go. It was took time to partition Poland. So let's talk about how the partition actually worked.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, it took place in three different moments. 1772 was the first bite that these three countries each took of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth territories. And then Poles rebounded a bit to the extent that they actually wrote their own constitution to show that they were perfectly well capable of ruling themselves, and that got the partitioning powers scared enough to partition it yet another time, so take even more land, although this time Maria Theresa did not participate. And then finally, after an insurrection run by Tadeusz Kościuszko, who fought on both the American in the American Revolution as well as in this insurrection in the Commonwealth. Then they partitioned it finally in 1795, leaving nothing left of that former enormous country. And that would set the tone for the entire 19th century, what I like to call the long 19th century, starting from the partitions of Poland. And each of these rulers, or each of the countries, because the rulers were changing with time as well, had a different attitude towards its Polish population. And that too evolved over time.
So let's talk about begin with the partition side of Russian side, and then talk about how they were treated by Russia as a fiefdom and newly, I wouldn't say conquered, but newly acquired territory of Russia.
Yes, well, Russia got the biggest piece of territory of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it at the beginning let the lands rule themselves more or less as they had ruled themselves. It was actually the least interfering in the way that things went. It's simply they were part of Russia. But then we have the Napoleonic Wars, and the fighting of Polish legions.
I want to come back to the Napoleonic Wars a little bit later. So
okay, well, we'll jump over that, but I'm just trying to explain the relationship with Russia.
Yeah.
It's the Poles tend to get most upset by Russian treatment ultimately. And if they have insurrections, it tends to be mostly against Russian rule. Let me put it that way. When you look at the Prussian partition, they more or less tried to integrate everything into their own system and make it more Prussian from the very beginning.
And as we will talk about a little later, of course, the city of Danzig would become vital important to Hitler in the Second World War.
This is jumping way ahead, but yes, indeed.
Yeah, I'm just saying about the Prussian integration because there was a lot of Germans. Was that part of it when from the partition?
Well, there were Germans. There were Germans, but they weren't necessarily Prussian Germans, or not Hohenzollern Prussian Germans, but the Germans that had actually lived there for centuries. So yes, there were Germans there, but they at a certain point they were very unhappy at the rise of Ducal Prussia next to them. So it's not that being German did not necessarily make you any more friendly to each other.
Now, I want to go back to the Russian side a little bit before we go to the Habsburg, because from my understanding, as when it came to when Alexander became Tsar of Russia, he actually kind of fused Poland a little bit, the Polish side as a little bit experimental on some of his reforms as well. So from my understanding, Alexander was a little bit liberal with Poland, and he tried to, see what he can do with the Polish provinces. So let's talk a little bit about Alexander's plan for Poland.
Yeah, if you can talk about any Tsar being liberal, I guess you could say Alexander had some liberal streak in him. He actually worked very closely with one of the Polish noblemen, Czartoryski, Adam Czartoryski.
And had a Polish mistress as well.
Yeah, well, who knows how influential the mistresses are in this case, but yes, indeed, that's true. But he seemed to want to use Poland as a test tube, if you will, for reform. to try reform out in the Polish-controlled lands, the core Polish lands. And so, yes, things looked pretty good under Alexander. Now, his brother Nicholas was a different character altogether. And that's when the Poles rebelled. Because what I should say about the instance with Alexander, what you have, this is after the Napoleonic Wars, when you have the creation of a kingdom of Poland that is united to Russia by its ruler. That is, the Tsar of Russia is king of Poland. Now, as long as Alexander was there, things went rather smoothly. But his brother did not like the idea that the autocratic Tsar of all Russia had to be just a regular king in the Kingdom of Poland. And so things got messy, and an insurrection broke out in 1830. And things went downhill from there. But under Alexander, you're absolutely right. Things looked more promising. And in fact, at that time, that was the best place to be Polish, was in the Kingdom of Poland under Alexander's rule.
So forgive me for jumping a little bit back and forth, but I'm going to discuss the Napoleonic Wars a little bit more soon. But first, I want to talk about Poland under Habsburg rule. So, and then as we talked about later, of course, like Maria, they were saying that Maria Theresa wept.
That's right.
More the famous saying. But let's talk about Polish territory under Maria Theresa.
Well, under Maria Theresa and under her son Joseph, because they were co-rulers for a time, remember, they were trying to initiate various Enlightenment projects. They did make some moves that way, a lot of which was undone by the next ruler as things happened. But you had Enlightenment policies being introduced into the territory known as Galicia that I mentioned before. This is the southernmost territory of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
What is that territory today, Galicia?
Well, today it's southern Poland and western Ukraine.
So what was the treatment like under the Habsburg for the Poles? Because that both were Catholics, and did religion have a role in it, or did they view them as kind of second-class citizens, or how were they treated under the Habsburgs?
Well, that's a very good point you make about religion, because of course religion made a difference in the other two partitions, because Russians were Orthodox and the Germans were Protestants. But the Habsburgs were Catholics. It didn't seem to help the Poles at all in the beginning, but it did over time seem to make things a little bit smoother, because although in the early 19th century with Metternich in control of things, he was very anti-Polish. But when you get to the second half of the 19th century, you actually have a situation where Galicia gets a certain degree of autonomy within Austria-Hungary, and that makes it the best place to be Polish. So the last centuries of the 19th century are best lived out in Galicia.
Now it's time to talk about the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, we can jump back.
So I'm sorry for jumping a little bit back and forth, but it's important to get all three parts of the Polish partition as well. So we have to kind of jump a little bit back and forth. But we're back to the Napoleonic War, and I want to talk a little bit more about that part, because it's interesting. When Napoleon came, a lot of Poles, according to his biographer Michael Browers, they were actually very pro Napoleon, and a lot of them would fight by his side.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Hoping that he would create a new independent Poland but of course, as Michael Browers states, that doesn't seem to be in the mind of Napoleon at the time. And of course, in the fun part as well, he would take a Polish mistress as well, who would give him a child that, made sure that he would he should actually get an heir. That's why he would eventually divorce Josephine. That's another story. That's just a little fun fact there. But let's talk about Polish, how and why the Polish welcomed
Well,
Napoleon and would fight by his side, and the hopes for a Napoleonic rule, so to speak, in Poland.
well, the Poles, again, as you mentioned correctly, wanted a Poland to be recreated, and they thought that Napoleon was the vehicle by which they could get this. And indeed, it's true. There was a state for several years called the Duchy of Warsaw, created out of territories that Poles and Napoleon were able to get control over. And it did exist in the from about 1807 to 1815. So you do have something, sort of the beginnings of what they hope would be a return to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So Napoleon was a puppet Napoleonic state, mind you, with Napoleonic code and all that, but it still was the beginning. It was the first sign that there was a possibility in the 19th century that Poland could be reborn. Because the three partitioning powers at the end of the 18th century had sworn never to use the word Poland again. And
so that's why it was called the Duchy of Warsaw.
Duchy of Warsaw. Poland. I think that was probably a good reason. Although, again, then you do have the Kingdom of Poland created. So by Alexander's time, things change. But because you had first the Duchy of Warsaw, and then the successor state after the Congress of Vienna is the Kingdom of Poland, a small state there in the core Polish lands.
So let's talk about the Napoleonic occupation a little bit of the Duchy of Warsaw.
Well, it wasn't an occupation. There was a regular rule.
I'm simplifying. I'm using just to simplify a little bit.
Yeah, it was Poles ruling according to Napoleonic rule, essentially, Napoleonic law, that is. And though they were more concerned over fighting for more territory, in fact, they were winning pieces of territory from Maria Theresa, from Austria at this time, for example, making this state bigger and bigger. But then, of course, they were involved in the Napoleonic onslaught headed towards Moscow, of course, and we all know how that turned out.
Yeah. So let's talk about what happened to. Was there hope that even after Napoleon fell at Waterloo, that the Duchy of Warsaw would still?
Well, then it was essentially moot. Yeah, then we have to wait for the Congress of Vienna to decide the fate, and that, of course,
so let's talk about the Congress of Vienna and the fate of Poland as well.
This is a time in which you have Poland or Poles having no say in the outcome. It's other countries, the big, great powers, that are making the decisions of what is going on and what country gets to continue its existence and what country doesn't. And, although they may have had the ear of Alexander, that still didn't mean that they got what they fully wanted. Because, again, what was created out of this were two states. There was the Kingdom of Poland that I talked about, ruled by the Tsar of Russia as King of Poland. And then there was this tiny little creation around the city of Krakow, the old Polish capital in the south, that also was independent, right on the border of the three empires.
So, what happened to the Poles? Were the Poles who fought with Napoleon? Of course, those who survived the March of Moscow, or those who potentially veterans of the Polish Napoleonic League. Were they punished for this, for fighting alongside Napoleon, or were they just let away? Was there any punishment for siding with Napoleon?
Well, at that point, I think Alexander was actually very forgiving, which is probably unusual, but yes, I mean, it was it started out quite well, as I mentioned, for the Poles under Alexander.
So let's talk about Poland under Nicholas then. And as I mentioned, he was not a fan of the Poles and just being king. So what changed in regard that he kind of didn't like Poles very much, and how it went from being the liberal Tsar Alexander and going to the autocrat of Nicholas I?
Well, one of the things Poles had hoped for in having the Kingdom of Poland is that they would eventually also regain control over other territories that had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they wanted the more eastern territories to become part of the Kingdom of Poland, and that was certainly something that Nicholas was not going to give them at all. And Nicholas was supported. I don't want to get into Russian history because we have so many more centuries worth of history to go. But he had historians like Karamzin and other people out there saying, you can't treat the Poles better than you treat the Russians. And so there was some bad blood between the two that way. And as I mentioned earlier, in November 1830, you had an insurrection break out in the Kingdom of Poland. Poles had been hoping for support from the West. They had some moral support, but they got no military support. And so, of course, that was eventually put down by the Russians. But they dethroned Nicholas in the process. And so that, of course, got him quite upset.
And of course, we have as well the 1848 revolution that would come a few decades later. So let's talk a little. I know I'm jumping a little bit right now, but let's talk about a little bit about the impact of the 1848 revolution on Poland, and of course how Russia would become the kind of the gendarmerie. They would help with Hungary as well, of course.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the 1848 revolution.
Well, 1848 played out differently in the different partitions, as you may remember. I don't want to go into the entire history of the 1848 revolution, the springtime of peoples, they called it. There's something happening under Prussian rule. There's something happening under Austrian rule. For example, under Austrian rule, to keep the Poles in line, the Polish nobles in line, the Austrian government decides to emancipate the serfs, to win over the support of the common man for their side of things, as opposed to them being under the Polish nobles. So that was quite a big development in 1848 in Galicia.
So how did it play out, let's say, in Russia versus, because Nicholas would, of course, I believe, put them down quite brutally with sending in.
Well, there wasn't any insurrection in 1848 in the Polish lands under Russian rule. There was another insurrection later in 1863, but 1848 was not part of that picture.
Now, of course, another thing that happened in the 19th century, of course, and this is not just Poland, but pretty much entirety of Europe, is that America would become the land of opportunity, and even for the Poles as well. So let's talk about the Polish emigration to America.
Yeah, well, that's getting into the last decades of the 19th century and, of course, early 20th century. Yes, indeed. When you look at the Polish lands, I mean, not everything was. This is the 19th century. There's not that much industrialization happening in places like Galicia, for example. So you have overpopulation of the villages, land being subdivided until you can't make a living. So when it came to the opportunity to emigrate to the United States, for example, or Canada, or even South America, many people took up the opportunity. And this is the period of that great emigration.
So, what percentage of Poles did emigrate into the Americas?
Oh, that's hard to say because again, they're subdivided between the different countries. I mean, the earliest emigres actually came from under Prussian rule, believe it or not, and ended up in Texas, if creating their own town. They're called Panna Maria. Then you have a lot of people coming from Galicia and people coming from Russia. I mean, it is a big, significant enough percentage that the upper classes were concerned about this emigration because, of course, it did mean that there were less people in their villages and all that.
Did they try to stop the immigration that because of this concern that they said no,
Well,
you're not
it was
allowed to
hard to
leave, like
stop because
treat them like serfdom.
well, I mean, there's no serfdom anymore at this time.
I mean, they just wanted to treat it that way,
Yeah.
metaphorically, that you can't leave, we need you here, that kind of.
Well, I mean, it's because this is after serfdom that the people are able to move.
Yeah.
And serfdom ended under Russian rule in 1864. So only after that period can we talk about that.
So judging from what we talked about today in partition era, who would you say fared which of the partition from Prussia, the Habsburgs, and we haven't talked too much about, but mainly focused on the Russian side, but of the Habsburgs, the Prussians, and the Russian side, which one would you say fared the best in the partition era?
Well, again, we tend to look at the end of the partition era to determine that because things go up and down throughout the period. But as I mentioned, Galicia got that degree of autonomy and was essentially run by Poles from around 1867 through to World War I. And they were running politics. This was the era of mass politics. You could get in political parties. There were peasant parties as well as parties involving the upper classes. You have socialism. You've got other things going on there. It's all really very active. And this was a training ground for self-rule.
So that's and do forgive me for jumping a little bit, but we are running out of time, so we can't obviously we can't go through everything in the span of this episode. I would absolutely recommend reading the book after this because you get so much more detail on the partition era and in general on of the 1,000 years told. So if you feel like we haven't talked about discussed themes enough, then I would highly recommend reading the book, and we'll talk about this at the end of the episode, of course. But let's talk about Poland in the First World War and the creation of and consequences of the independent, because that's something I found fascinating reading your book when Poland finally became an independent state after World War I. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Poland in World War One, because as we talked, as you know, like when you have three different sides, the Russian Poles on the Russian side and on the Prussian side, and the Habsburgs, you have two different Poles on two different sides, possibly fighting each other.
Absolutely, that's what I was just going to say.
So what's the feeling there when you have Poles on the Russian side fighting Poles on the Prussian and Habsburg side? So how did what was there a feeling that we were killing our own brothers, or what was there a national feeling? Because obviously nationalism come into place at this time. But what's there a nationalistic feeling in Poland at this time, and how did the World War One play into this? That when you've had Poles fighting on different sides of the war.
Yeah, well, that of course is the most important thing to remember about the war is that you do have Poles fighting Poles because you've got Poles on the side of the Central Powers, right? Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then you've got Poles under Russia also being drafted. So I mean, it's a national tragedy if you want to look at it that way, but it's a national tragedy that actually turns out all right in the end because the end outcome of World War I was a resurrected Polish state. So, a lot of people then put aside their differences and said, well, listen, ultimately, we ended up right. This was something that one of the Polish military leaders, Józef Pilsudski, actually foresaw happening. He saw Russia being defeated or out of the war, and then the Central Powers being defeated by the West. And that's exactly what happened, because you had the Russian Revolution taking Russia out, and then you had the West finishing off the war with the Central Powers. So it turned out just like he had forecast.
But when Russia ended the war in came out of the war in 1917 in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, what was in it for the Polish state? But actually, before that, I want to ask because and like you said, it would eventually become an independent kingdom anyway in 1918. It's my understanding that if Germany had won the war in the World War, they had a plan to create an independent kingdom of Poland anyway, and just under a puppet Polish Prussian Polish king under Prussian puppets as a Prussian puppet state. So
well, they were trying to promise things like that, but they were being very vague about what kind of territory might be involved, and Poles didn't buy that too well.
But let's talk about the newly created independent of Poland after 1918, because one of the more fascinating aspects I found when I read your book is that there wasn't much of a national identity necessarily, because the Russians, Polish on the Russian side, had been under Russian rule for so long, and the Polish on the Prussian side had been on the Prussian side. So there was a difficulty struggling trying to find a kind of single national unity, from my understanding of that, because they have been partitioned for so many three different nations and empires. So how was the feeling after being united after almost over 2 centuries of partition?
Well, the feeling, actually, when you look at the top level of society, was generally pretty united and positive. What the concerns were reaching the lower classes, reaching the peasantry, which of course had been emancipated by the empires. And so that was one concern. But basically, when putting Poland back together in the form that it took after World War I, well, first of all, the borders had to be fought for. There actually were 6 wars that followed World War I that determined Poland's borders. And then, of course, you had to knit the country together physically. You had railroads going out in the direction of Moscow or Petersburg, going in the direction of Berlin, going in the direction of Vienna. You didn't have them all coming in and crossing the way you would need to make a unified Polish state. You had different coinage. You had different other sorts of things. I mean, there's a lot of things that needed to be done by this very young and not exactly wealthy state, because what was it inheriting, to recreate itself.
Now, of course, one man would come in and become a dictator of Poland, and for the next decades, and that, of course, is. I want to talk about the rise of. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I'm trying to look at. I found out to see if I can do it right. Joseph Pilsudski. So let's talk about So let's talk about the rise of Pilsudski and his rise to power, that he would become a dictator until 1935. So let's talk about the influence and how Pilsudski would rule Poland in his years.
Okay. Well, again, one of the problems you alluded to earlier about recreating Poland is that you also had a very uneven experience in democratic rule over this period. Very few people had the opportunity to serve politically in the various countries, and so the democracy was weak and fragile. And Pilsudski, as I already mentioned, figured militarily in the recreation of the Polish state, but he did not want to lead Poland initially, and left it to others to do so. And that was a sort of an up and down period, the 1920s. And of course, at a certain point, he got fed up with the vagaries of democratic rule and decided to come in 1926 with a coup d'etat. And that, of course, was a big move on his part, not supported by everyone, but he did manage to win over power. And then he sort of sat back and dictated a little bit from the sides, if I may say so.
Actually, before that, I want to talk about, the 1921 war with Russia before, because that is important as well, because that was actually a Polish victory over the Red Army and the newly created Red Army, and which they thought would, and Trotsky would, of course, win the war with Poland easily. So let's talk a little bit about, how Poland won the 1921 war with Russia.
Absolutely. This was the most important of the 6 wars that were fought to determine Poland's borders. And this was to determine Poland's eastern borders. Again, there had been Poles with experience in all the different armies, and they all came together and united and did what they could to fight against the Russians. In fact, Poles first made their way all the way to Kyiv before being pushed back and then being attacked almost at the gates of Warsaw. And this so-called miracle on the Vistula took place, and Pilsudski was able to turn the tide on the Russians and push them out. So it was really quite an interesting war, the Polish-Soviet War, but one that kept at bay the communist menace, the Bolshevik menace, because the Bolsheviks wanted to go through Poland and make their way to Germany, make their way further west. And this war prevented them from doing so. So it had to be communism in one country as opposed to turning all of Europe red.
Now, I'm sorry for interrupting you earlier, but was that victory partly why Pilsudski managed to take power in 1926?
Well, Pilsudski was very well thought of, generally speaking, anyways. But yes, indeed, I'm sure that was part of his mystique. I mean, Pilsudski had a whole cult, if I may say so, in the interwar period of his that was propagated by his former legionnaires, people who fought under him during World War I, and of course in the Polish-Soviet War.
So let's talk about Pilsudski's roots and of course the rise of Nazi Germany as well, and how the Nazi-Polish relations went. And I want to talk as well about how the guarantee from the Allied side became, how they signed the guarantee that if Poland were attacked by Germany, they would intervene on behalf of Poland. So let's talk about how that came to place, the rule of Pilsudski in Poland and its relation with what would eventually become. Actually, as we want to talk about as well, was there good relations between Weimar Germany and Poland before, and how this would change between Hitler's rise to power and, of course, how this would eventually lead to World War II.
Yeah, well, Poland was a struggling country, and it was looking for allies and the like, looking to France. Its neighbors were not all so happy with it because of the border disputes, and of course, when Hitler came to power, Pilsudski realized that he was sitting in between a rock and a hard place. I mean, he had the enemy of a rising Germany on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. And so he had to do what he could diplomatically to try to keep both of these forces at bay. But he realized that it was just a question of time before something happened. And of course, something did happen in 1939, as we all know.
So, considering that they won, and I believe both armies were pretty poorly when the Soviet attacked us, they were equally poorly matched as the Polish were. But why the lack of militarization when you have such an aggressive country as Germany, Nazi Germany, on your border? And why? Because they pretty much, from my understanding, they fought the campaign with still equipment from World War I, if not older equipment. So why the lack of militarization when you see this? Because Hitler, of course, kind of took Germany in less than a month. Sorry, Poland in less than a month, and when he kept annexing both, Czechoslovakia and Austria and all this, the Rhineland. Why did they not realize that maybe we should do something with the military here? Maybe it could become a threat to us in the future, which indeed he did become a threat to the future. So why the lack of militarization of Pilsudski's behalf, considering he was won a victory against Russia and the Soviets? Why the lack of militarization?
Well, I wouldn't say there was a lack of militarization. It just was not sufficient to deal with the German buildup. Poles were in the process of creating a central industrial complex that was going to help them build this military and armaments and all that. But this is after the Great Depression. Things were not going fast. The country was suffering that way. And so, I mean, it did have a military culture and had an army, and the soldiers fought quite valiantly, I should say, if it took them a month to be defeated by the Nazis. I think France will tell you a different story. They were further hamstrung by the fact that you had the Germans invade on the 1st of September, and on the 17th you have the Soviets invade from the east. So it was not exactly like Poland was trying to fight one war at one time. It had two fronts with two great enemies, and it was a very precarious situation to be in.
So let's talk about the eventual Ribbentrop Pact. Sorry, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact.
Yeah.
I do keep confusing the World War I one and the World War II one, but let's talk about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and how this would affect Poland, and of course, eventually how they would later, of course, invade Poland. Germany would invade Poland fully in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what I was just referring to. You have this pact signed between Hitler and Stalin, literally, about a week before the Germans invade. I mean, they knew what the outcome was. It was the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union being allies, which people sometimes forget about when they look at the history, because then later, of course, a couple years later,
Russia certainly seems to forget about it.
Russia completely blocks that out entirely. Russia thinks the war began when Nazi Germany invaded Russia, but they forget the part that came before that, with Russia on completely the wrong side of the war.
So, and of course, this is something I'm going to have to cover a lot more of in the future, and it's an episode, it's not the entire podcast in the summer. Let's talk about the consequences of German intervention, and how it once again were kind of partitioned between two countries.
Absolutely, we call that the fourth partition.
And I want to talk a little bit about the Russian. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the Russian side as well before we go in Poland in the Russian occupation from 1939 to 1941, before we go into the German occupation of World War II.
Yeah. Well, you have on the Russian side Russians moving in and creating out of these territories new republics, if you will, getting sham voting in and all that. And you have the export of many of the people of the territories into Siberia or worse. You had the situation where Polish officers were removed from the territories into places like Katyn, which would become famous later as a place of mass murder of the Polish officers, regular officers and reserve officers who were massacred there.
Denied, of course.
This is in the spring of 1940. Their bodies won't be found until 1943, after the Germans come in, and then the Soviets blame the Germans on having killed the Polish officers, but it was they who had done so. So they were trying to decapitate the nation That is, thinking that the best and the brightest, the officers, and removing them into the depths of their country and then murdering them.
Was there an attempt of Sovietification, for the lack of a better word, in this? Was there an attempt of Sovietification, for the lack
Of
of a better word,
Sovietization.
in the occupied
Absolutely,
Russian
that's what
side?
they did right away. They tried to turn the territories gained by them into an integral part of the Soviet Union. Absolutely. So that's what you had under Soviet rule, and it was there were a lot of people, not just Poles suffered. You have Ukrainians suffering, others suffering. Absolutely.
So let's talk about the German occupation now, because obviously this is the one of the most darkest times in Polish history. So let's talk about how the German occupation of Poland attempted were and the consequence for the Polish people, because for the Germans they were subhuman, they weren't even second class, even not fourth class citizens
Yeah.
in the German point of view. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of Hitler's Lebensraum came into the picture of Poland. It was the idea to completely eradicate the Poles, as well as you had planned to do with the Czechs, or was that the
Well,
plan?
eradicate maybe not, but to use them as low level labor was certainly the thing. They also had the decapitation of the intelligentsia under Germans. For example, the professoriate of the Jagiellonian University was called to a meeting and then deported into the depths of Germany, where many of them died. Yeah, I mean, Germans did not treat Poles like regular human beings. And of course, they did not treat Jews like regular human beings either. And we know that this is an integral part of the history of World War II, is the Holocaust.
So let's talk about, before going into the Holocaust, I want to talk about the Jewish ghetto
Well, that's
in
part of
different
it.
parts of Poland. Yeah. So let's begin with the Jewish ghetto in Poland, Polish cities.
Well, actually, the first thing that the Germans did when it came to killing Jews was, when they were advancing with their forces, they had so-called Einsatzgruppen, and they were set to kill by shooting the Jews and communists and whomever. So that was the first stage of this. Then you have the ghettoization of the lands under Nazi German occupation, right? Under inhuman conditions, squeezed into small territories. It was, and then of course from there you have the extermination part, which I think is the most familiar to people, the part of the death camps.
Now, I want to talk, before we go into the death camp, I'm sorry for stalling a little bit, I want to talk, and we made an episode about this a while ago, about Auschwitz, and where we talked about this in more detail. But I want to talk a little bit about the home front and the Polish exile government as well. And then, before we go into the Polish exile government, I want to talk a little bit about one of the most famous home front armies, called Armia Krajowa. Would you explain what that means? Would you explain what that means, and of course their contribution to the Polish resistance movement?
Oh yeah, well,
arguably one of the most famous resistance groups in Poland under the World War II, I would say.
Oh yeah, well, it certainly,
there were others, of course, but
it was the biggest underground army of this kind during the war. The home army, the Armia Krajowa that you mentioned, very sophisticated, very well developed. Doing what it could to sabotage German efforts. They even sent somebody into Auschwitz to see what things were like and report on it. And
there's a movie about this, isn't there? That came out a while ago. There was a movie about this.
Oh, probably, maybe more than one, but
yeah. But yeah, let's talk about, and as well, let's talk about the Polish exile government. Of course, Stalin were not a fan, as we will come back to later. But let's talk a little bit of Polish government in exile in London as well.
Well, again, the Poles had to act very quickly and decisively to create a government, a continuation of their government outside their territory. I mean, when you think about what happened during the first occupation, the Polish government tried to escape from the country, going out the southeasternmost end of the country into Romania and Hungary, and they had to sort of deputize people to continue on with the government in the West, and they got to France and got to Britain, and did what they could from abroad. I mean, it's hard not to be in your country, but when the country is occupied, as Poland was, they had no option, and so they spent the war in the West fighting for the country as best they could under very adverse circumstances.
But from my understanding, Churchill were kind of suck up to Stalin eventually. We have the famous line where he draws on a napkin. The famous story goes where he draws the partition of this is Soviet influence and this is going to be Western influence. And
Yeah,
but let's talk about Churchill's treatment of this Polish government in exile, because it wasn't very, put a lot better, were nice to the Polish, from my understanding, especially when it came to meetings with Stalin and how they would handle Poland in the aftermath of World War II. He kind of became very upset with the Poles and how he felt like they didn't appreciate him. And from my understanding, reading this part of history. So let's talk about how his relationship with the Polish exile government.
Mm-hmm. Well, first you have to remember there are a lot of Poles who actually ended up fighting on the side of the West with the Western armies, and you even have in Britain Polish pilots playing a huge role in the Battle of Britain. All of this seems to be forgotten by those who are dealing with the Polish government in exile. That is, they clearly treated the government well. I don't want to go into the details, but they certainly did not support it as they should have during the war, given all the contributions of Poles to the war outcome.
Now let's go back to and I stole this a little bit, but let's go to move on soon. But let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust, so because it is a vital part of history, and I wouldn't say, I'm not sure if fortunate is the right word, but I was actually in Auschwitz in 10th grade.
Oh yeah,
Really deep experience.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the Holocaust. That, of course, is mostly known about Polish occupation.
Yeah. Well, again, as I mentioned, it took place. It didn't all look like Auschwitz from the outset, and that's why I wanted to emphasize earlier that you first had the episodes where you had people, the Nazi Germans, simply shooting at the Jews face to face, not this sort of a crematorium experience that we all come to associate with the Holocaust. So there were different aspects of the Holocaust in the lands that used to be Polish, because this is all done under occupation. These are not Polish death camps; they're death camps run by Nazi Germany. Correct. And the situation was very difficult in the country that way. I mean, you had most of the Jews were already, the Polish Jews were already killed by the time that Auschwitz really got running and taking in so many Jews coming from the West, right?
Were many non-Jews, how many Poles ended up in the concentration camps that were not necessarily Jews or homosexual, but just ended up there in the concentration camp?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, because the first people in Auschwitz were Poles. The first transport came from the city of Tarnów, and they ended up in Auschwitz. And this is when it was functioning more like a concentration camp, not an extermination camp. That developed with time. But you had prisoners, the ones with the smallest numbers tattooed to their arms, turned out to be Polish.
So, and then we go into much great, like I said earlier, we go into much greater deal about Auschwitz in an episode we did earlier. So I would highly recommend checking that one out. And we don't have to move on because we don't have much time left. So let's talk about the Soviet re-occupation, if you will, of Poland and the consequences of the Red Army coming into a mass rape and a mass destruction of the Red Army. And I want to specifically mention the destruction of Warsaw. That was the German doing it, of course, but I want to specifically mention the destruction of Warsaw as well as a consequence of the German re-invasion of Poland.
Well, let's start with the destruction of Warsaw, because that's related to the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. What Poles did, the Home Army was trying to figure out what to do to keep the Soviet army from coming in and occupying and liberating Warsaw. So they decided they were going to start an uprising in the city of Warsaw so that they themselves could liberate the city from the Germans before the Soviets arrived. The Soviets ended up camping outside the city and watching as the Germans essentially annihilated the Polish population there, and took many more away to camps, and then of course systematically bombed the city into smithereens. I mean, you look at at photos of Warsaw after the war, you can't see Warsaw. I mean, there is nothing that looks like the city. So this was extremely devastating, and of course something that any Polish state, if a Polish state was to be built again, which of course the Nazis did not want, would have to deal with eventually down the line, and that came under Soviet control.
And what's fascinating about Warsaw is that it was rebuilt by not because Stalin certainly didn't want to do shit for Poland. Excuse my language, French, but it was actually rebuilt by the local people, by the people of Warsaw. So that's one of the more fascinating aspects of this, is that Warsaw actually were rebuilt by the people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important point.
So let's talk about the Red Army entering Poland. As you may know, it's certainly wasn't very friendly treatment they gave Poles as well, and especially the Home Army and partisans of Poland. If you were found to be a partisan, you were shot on the spot. So let's talk a little bit about the treatment of the Poles. But even communists were not treated very friendly by the Polish army. So let's talk
most
about
of
the Red Army.
I should say most of the communists had already been exported into the Soviet Union prior to the war, and many of them had already lost their lives. So that's one thing. I'm sorry, I forgot what your question was about.
The invasion by the Red Army.
By the Red Army. Yeah. Well, of course, the Red Army
and the treatment of both partisans and
Yeah, they were liberating the country, right? But of course, what they were out to do is to eradicate any signs of Polish possible resistance, and that would mean anyone who had belonged to the Home Army or into any of the other partisan groups that formed. It was the encounter was not very pleasant.
Brutal.
It was brutal.
So, and there was a lot of rape by the Red Army on both women of all ages as well, and this is not talked much about, but it's necessary. I think it's necessary to bring up.
Yes, well,
it's the Red Army generally were monstrous, to put it that way.
Yeah, it's true. They found anyone fair game, even if they were supposedly liberating them. They were liberating them in ways that they did not want to be liberated, including sexually.
Mm. And I thought about this. I mean, 2-3 years ago. I don't remember how long time ago now, but I made an episode of the Soviet invasion of Berlin a few years ago, and we talked about if there's one country that's truly been stabbed in the back in history, it's Poland, because they kind of went the West, and it shows kind of the hypocrisy of the Western powers, because they went to war for Poland, but they gave it up to Stalin.
Yeah.
So there's one country that's truly been stabbed in the back, it's not Germany, but it's Poland, that were just given up to the rule and mercy of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, that's true. I mean, Poles thought they were sold out at Yalta. And Yalta became a bad word for Poles. Yeah.
So let's talk about how the rest of half the century where Poland would be under communist rule, and how this would come, and how they would adapt to the new lifestyle under communism. And I want to point out that early on, in the early years after the Second World War, they actually did try to have elections, but the Soviets ironically lost every election, so they eventually had to enforce the Soviet government into the Polish USSR. So let's talk a little bit about how Poland would fare under the Soviet century.
Well, first we need to talk about the switch of the borders, because when we have interwar Poland, it was very much a heterogeneous country, as had been the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for centuries. You still had big Ukrainian, Belarusian, some Lithuanians, other Germans, plenty of Jews. Everyone was in that country. And the country had a border that went substantially further to the east than what you will imagine today, looking at today's Poland. So what you essentially had was the fact that Poles did not regain the eastern territories, and instead were given a little bit of German territories in the west. So you have this whole shift of people, populations, lands taking place during this initial period. It was sort of a Wild West period, one might say.
So how did the Sovietification of Poland, and how much support? Because obviously it doesn't seem to be massive support for Soviet rule when they seem to lose every election. But how did people eventually kind of adapt to the new Soviet style?
Well, first they falsified elections, and so that's how they won. That's been proven. But Poles did not take it sitting down. That is, after Stalin, is the period of Stalinism was really quite oppressive. You have a whole series of what I call Polish hiccups. I write about it in the book. You have Poles publicly protesting in ways that you do not see happening in other countries of the East or Soviet bloc. I mean,
you have the 1956 Hungary.
Yeah, well, you've got 56 in Hungary. You have 56 in Poland. You have 68 in Czechoslovakia. You have 68 in Poland. In Poland, you have 70, 76. Then you have the Polish Pope, who helps to embolden Poles to engage in 1980 in the creation of independent trade unions known as Solidarity.
And of course, as we mentioned in part 1, he would sanctify Jadwiga as a saint as well.
Yep. Well, the Pope did a lot.
Let's talk a little bit about religion under Soviet rule in Poland, because religion were theoretically illegal, of course, when they practice it anyway. But let's talk about how they would cope with the religion and the the banishment of religion under Soviet rule.
Yeah, well, it was frowned upon, of course. One last thing I want to say about
Yeah,
the changing of the borders and everything. I mean, when we talk about today's Poland, I just want to emphasize the fact that after the war, it was for the first time you have a country in which the majority population is of Polish extraction. This is the first time since maybe medieval times, and even maybe not then, that you have ethnic Poles uh, occupying the entirety of the country, or practically the entirety of the country. And I think that's an important point to make, since we're talking about 1,000-year history of Poland. So this is really a caesura that's quite sharp when we look at things historically. And now, of course, I've forgotten what your question was again.
That's fine. I thought you also wanted to know about how
the church.
Pope just being Poland and the church under Soviet Russia, and of course, like you said, they would eventually elect, and that's quite fascinating how they would get a Polish Pope, considering that religion were banned.
Well, it wasn't banned, but it was definitely frowned upon entirely, and the priests were surveilled and all kinds of things like that. It was very hard to get a new church built. For example, you have the construction outside of Krakow of a sort of model Soviet industrial city called Nowa Huta, and the Poles had to put up an awful lot of protests before they were allowed to build a church in that area that was supposed to be a model, a Soviet a city, if you would, a counterweight to the old Krakow. But I mean, Poles still went to church. Probably not communist Poles, because they would not have been allowed in the party. But others still did go to church, and there was only so much that the Soviets could do to oppress Poles. I mean, you can't take everything away. I mean, they fared better than did some of the other countries that way in this regard, certainly as far as religion was concerned. And of course, then you have the Polish Pope. I mean, someone who, started becoming a priest during the wartime and made his way up in the hierarchy, made his way to Vatican II, and surprise, surprise, ends up becoming the Pope in 1978. I mean, this was something completely unforeseen, unpredicted. I mean, since when had they not had an Italian Pope? And it, of course, completely emboldened Poles to think differently about themselves, about their nation, about their country.
And now I can't think of a time they haven't have had a Italian Pope.
I'm sorry?
Now I can't think of a time when they have had an Italian Pope in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, things have been different of late, but for a long time it was all Italian popes.
But what about the worker and Polish worker in the Soviet Union?
Well,
what was their life? How did their life change from say Warsaw, from the Second World War until under Soviet communism?
Well, remember that Poland was a heavily agricultural country historically. Even in the interwar period, it was still very heavily agricultural.
Yeah.
And this only changes with the Soviets and their push for industrialization. So you have peasants becoming workers, and that they bring their peasant culture into the work environment as well.
But and I want to follow up on that question, because as you mentioned, it was an agricultural farmers, and the farmers were looked upon, I believe, as kulaks. So how did they react to how did the kulaks treated by the Soviets as well?
Polish peasants were not treated the same way as peasants were in other East Bloc countries. They got off much more easily. I mean, it's not that they had an easy life, but they were not all collectivized as they were elsewhere. There was attempts at doing it.
If I may mention, sorry for interrupting you, but someone I know from Estonia, she mentioned that her family had a farm, I think, and they lost everything because of communism, because they were kulaks,
Yeah, yeah.
and so they lost everything because of they lost it all because the Soviet takeover.
Yeah, and that was very typical of most of the rest of Eastern Europe. But again, there were just so many peasants, and it would be such a. I mean, they'd all hope for land reform with the Soviets, so they would get more land, not less.
So how did that work compared to other Soviet blocks where kulaks were trustworthy, where Poles got up so easily?
Well, there was a
Was
love-hate
it simply because they
relationship.
were agriculture? Was it simply because they already were such a big agricultural country? Or I mean, Ukraine was kind of the same, right? They were, well, the grain basket, as they say,
Yeah.
of Russia. So what was the difference between Poland and say Ukraine in that regard?
Well, the Ukrainians were collectivized completely. There's no denying that. Poles were not. They started trying to do it, and then they had to abandon the project. So, as I said, Polish farmers essentially continued on more or less as they always had, because they weren't being supported particularly well by the government. The government had a love-hate relationship. I mean, it wanted them to produce food, but it preferred workers to farmers.
So I'm sorry again for skipping a little bit ahead. I'm sure there's a lot, and I'm not going to make a specific episode about this in the future, of course. But what about when the Soviet Union fell in 1991? How did a new independent Poland emerge? Of course, as we know, the 90s were quite brutal for post-Soviet countries. So how did the 90s kind of help form the new, and for third time, independent Poland? So how did a new independent Poland for good this time? Let's hope so.
Well, we have to
How
talk
did
about
this
how we got
emerge?
there, because if it
Yeah,
weren't for
of course.
Poland, I don't know how easy it would have been for 1989 to happen. You jumped ahead to 91 in the Soviet Union, but remember, we had a lot of things going on in Eastern Europe in 1989. And one of the things I would argue is that Poland was the first domino in this domino effect of the Soviet era coming to an end in Eastern Europe. Remember,
A lot of people contribute Ukraine to the fall, being the first domino.
no, Ukraine wasn't the first domino. I mean, in the Soviet Union, yes, but remember, we have the Soviet bloc and we have the Soviet Union, two separate things. I mean, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these are places also where people were not happy with Soviet rule. But I'm talking about 1989. Maybe you're too young to remember it. Yeah. But for me, I mean,
I was born in 94, so yeah, I wasn't born yet.
Well, see, well, 1989 is an extremely important year. It's the year in which there was a Polish
perestroika, right?
Well, no, perestroika started a little bit earlier, but what you had was permission being given in Poland for the first semi-free elections, where you could have regular elections take place. And that happened on the same day as Tiananmen Square in China. The thing is, in China, it was a disaster. In Poland, it was wonderful because they essentially booted out the communists, voted them out. It was high noon, if you think about the old Gary Cooper film, for the Poles, and they rose to the occasion and voted them out. And so this led to the initiation of the beginning of the fall of communism in the region. And then it just went domino effect to each country in a row around the bloc.
I want to go a little bit back again and ask about, because in Germany, we always read about, how people try to escape the Soviet bloc, crossing the wall and crossing the border. Whether escaped, and obviously that was easier in Germany because they actually bordered to a Western country, but was their attempt to escape from this West Soviet bloc in Poland as well? And obviously, it was more difficult
Well,
than
there was no
it was in Germany.
no contiguous country to which they could escape. I mean, think.
Yeah,
They had Soviets on one side, Czechoslovakia to the south,
but
East
was there still
Germany.
attempts? Did people still try to get out of the Soviet, even as difficult as it may seem? Did people still try to get out?
Well, people who went abroad sometimes, who had been allowed to go abroad, managed never to come back. That they certainly did. You have
But what about?
people like
Sorry.
Czesław Miłosz, the famous Polish writer, ending up in the West and not coming back.
So let's get back to my original question then about how the 90s were for, because this is the first poll, and the last 10 decades left. So let's talk about how the 90s were for Poland as a new independent country.
Well, when you think about the challenges, I think you have three different layers of challenges. You've got political, economic, and then sovereignty involved. So you have to get to democracy first. This took some doing, right?
Yeah.
But it was something that the Poles
I mean,
started.
that was the case for most post-Soviet countries.
I'm sorry?
That was a problem for most Polish countries, and some still even struggle with it today.
Still struggled, but Poles got a bit of a head start with their first election, so at least they were trying very hard to do that. Economically, they went through shock therapy, trying to get the economy out of the old Soviet command economy and into a capitalist form. Again, very uneven development, but they went at it forcefully, thinking that it was better to do it hard, suffer now and hope that things took off, than to do it piecemeal and suffer completely for a long time. And that essentially worked with Poland, although, of course, there are still many people who remember the 90s not very fondly because there was a lot of economic dislocation. And then last, of course, you have this whole issue of being sovereign. And that may have been the easiest part once the Soviet Union decided it wasn't going to interfere in what was happening. And when it disintegrated, of course, that was even less of a threat that way.
Now, it seems that especially if you ask all the Russian communists, that if you ask what was better now, under capitalism or Soviet or communism, then would most people say communism. Seem to say communism, but if you ask a Pole the same question, what would the answer be? If how an ex-Soviet Pole, for the lack of better words, what would he or she respond if you ask what would you prefer to? Capitalism or communism? What would their answer be?
Well, I would think that most Poles would be on the side of capitalism, although, of course, it may be a generational thing as well. Different generations perceive the changes in different ways. I mean, there are people, of course, like you, who don't remember the communist period. For whom only capitalism is all you know. People who lived through the communist period and actually were upwardly mobile during the communist period, because then many people going from the farm to becoming workers or to becoming educated at university or so on. I mean, people made their careers that way. Some of them may have more sentiment towards the period just because it was not a bad period for them. But I would, of course, there are fewer and fewer of those now today. I mean, it's hard for me to believe how many years have passed since 1989. We have
40
many
years. It feels like
generations.
less.
I'm sorry?
I think it's almost 40 years now.
It's approaching, yeah, I think so, approaching 40 years. And when you think about it, I mean, I always look at the history of the interwar period as being a short one. That was only 20 years. Poles have had almost double time since then to set their country straight. And of course, they've done a lot to set their country straight. And they've managed to join...
unemployment is one of the lowest since it ever been in Poland right now. And they actually seem to be quite a good place country to live in at the
Absolutely.
moment, at least.
Poland is
Which
on the
is why,
rise. Poland
which
joined.
is why I want to ask.
I'm sorry?
Sorry for interrupting you, but I want to ask because in the recent election there've been a far right politician who won this year's election in Poland. So, what are your expectations going from this election forward? Because, like we said, Poland is on the rise and it's quite a decent country to live in. So, will this ruin? Will he be able to ruin what Poland has, or what do you think will it become more of a Russian friendly country now, or what do you think will happen to Poland with the far right politician winning this year's election?
Well, in Poland, it's very hard to be pro-Russian, historically and otherwise. So that part is not as scary as other aspects of this new president. But I should remind you, this is one president. This is one person, and the president is not the strongest person in Poland, given the parliamentary system that is in place. The previous election of
It's not like American politics, though,
no, it's not like American politics at all that way. I mean, the president is much more of a figurehead. He can veto legislation. That's a problem if you don't have enough people to override his veto. But he does not himself set the tone for the country. The more important election, in my view, more recently took place 2 years ago. And that was
local
for
elections.
the parliament. And the coalition that is ruling now had unseated the government of the Law and Justice Party that had been in place for a number of years. And that was a much more populist type of government.
So, what are your expectations for the future of Poland going forward from this?
Well, I think Poland is going to go through a rocky period like the rest of the universe right now. When you look at it, I mean, populism is on the rise everywhere. The government is going to have to do what it can to maintain itself if it doesn't want to slide further to the right. I mean, it's a challenging time, but economically, Poland's doing very well. I mean, they're doing the best out of anyone in the East Bloc. You know, it's hard. I mean, right now for I think democratic governments everywhere, and it remains to be seen. You know, you know what more about the rest of Europe probably than I do, but it remains to be seen where countries end up leaning and who is influenced by what is happening in the United States, who can go opposite to that. I mean, we just had this big march in Hungary this weekend. I mean, that seems to be saying that the Hungarians are ready to move in the opposite direction from populism.
Do you think we will have a Maidan type revolution in Hungary, or do you think?
I'd like to see where their next elections turn out. I don't know that they would do Maidan. Maidan is definitely a very Ukrainian thing, and they've done that repeatedly.
I mean, to do the comparison.
Yeah.
That there will be something similar.
You think that they'll rise up that way? But again, it would need a catalyst of sorts. And elections, if elections were falsified or something, that would be a catalyst, say.
No, and that's just a whole another episode because our focus here has been Poland for the first 1,000 years. And thank you so much for joining us. I think we're going to round it up there. I hope you enjoyed this two-part episode on Poland. Of course, we only touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Polish history. And if you want to read further, where can people find your book on Poland the first 1,000 years? And so, of course, and I highly recommend reading more about Polish history because it's super fascinating. I hope this was an inspiration to start reading more about it, because I certainly find Polish history super interesting and something I definitely want to cover more of on the podcast in the future. And again, where can people find your book? Where are you?
Well, you can.
On social media. Do you have any further you want to promote?
Well, again, you can find the book in hardcover, paperback. There's an ebook, and there's also an audio book. So for even those who prefer listening to history, you can do it that way. And you can find me on various social media as well.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great fun to have you on. This has been Without Age 12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be very nice. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider giving us 5 stars as well and leave a review. You can also leave a comment on Spotify these days, so that would be very, very nice. If you have a favorite, if you're on YouTube, leave a comment if you have any favorite aspects of Polish history. If there's part of what we discussed today that you wanted to cover more of, leave a comment and say so. And I will try to cover more of the aspects you request. And of course, we are available on social media. It's getting late and getting tired. Sorry about that. But we are available on social media under Instagram, Twitter, or Blue Sky, and with that age 12. It's pretty straightforward. You can find us there. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.